Hello students and welcome to the slot 2 analysis of Maharashtra MBA CET 2024. The second slot of this CET happened on 9th of March, that is Saturday. It was scheduled from 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Let us start by first discussing the pattern of this year's CET paper in slot 2. Now the paper pattern was along the expected lines as it was declared earlier. There were total 200 questions to be answered in 150 minutes. Now a big surprise this year or this slot was that the paper was in terms of sections. So it was not a jumbled paper. The sections were separately accessible. There was a drop down menu at the top of the screen from which you can select which section you want to attempt the questions. The questions were all numbered from 1 to 200. It started with logical reasoning 75 questions, and then there were abstract reasoning 25 questions, then quant 50 questions, and verbal reasoning and reading comprehension 50 questions. So they went in that order, but you can jump to any of the sections by clicking on that drop down menu and selecting which section you want to go to. Okay, the questions each carried 1 mark. There were 5 options for each question, and there was exactly 1 correct option out of the 5. There was no negative marking. So if you answer any question incorrectly, there won't be any penalty for it. Now, let's look at the structure of the quantitative ability section first. Now, the quantitative ability section in slot 2 was a surprise in terms of its content because there were no data interpretation questions at all. Similarly, there were no questions of quantitative comparisons. There were no questions of number series or approximations. Out of the 50 questions present in this section, 46 questions were normal quantitative ability questions and 4 questions were based on data sufficiency. Let us discuss the breakup of the questions in this section. So, in those 46 questions, a good amount of questions were from arithmetic area. So, percentages consisted of 8 questions. Many out of these questions were one-liners. So, students who have memorized percent fraction conversions, for example, if students are aware that 12.5% is the fraction 1/8, there were 3 questions based upon that same percentage. So if you know 12.5% is 1/8, you would be able to solve those 3 questions very easily. So similarly, one-liners like 1.14 out of 1.9 is what percent. So such kind of questions were present. There were some challenging questions in this area, but overall percentages was easy. Then profit and loss, there were 4 questions asked, out of which 3 questions were one-liners, again very simple. 1 was slightly more difficult to calculate. Simple interest and compound interest, there were 3 questions that were asked, out of which 1 was based on simple interest and 2 were questions based on compound interest. And compounding was done semi-annually. So that concept needed to be known to students to be able to answer the questions. So a moderate difficulty questions of this topic. Average mixtures and allegations, there were again good number of questions, 8 of them. So many out of those were simple questions, one-liners, something like what is the average of the first 100 numbers. So those kind of questions were asked. Time and work, 3 questions were asked. 2 out of those questions were based upon groups of persons working and 1 was based on pipes and tanks. Time and distance, 4 questions were asked. Out of those 4 questions, 3 questions were based upon time taken by train to cross an object. So time taken by train to cross a pole, or time taken to cross a platform, time taken by one train to cross another train. So those kind of questions were there, 3 out of the 4. 1 question was based upon time taken by 2 trains to meet each other. A large number of questions were asked from the topic numbers. Now from numbers, a variety of questions was asked, but most, we can say majority of the questions were from the area LCM HCF. So LCM HCF questions were asked. There were questions based upon finding remainders, question based on finding factors, prime number concept was tested. So all these other areas also got tested, but LCM HCF questions were in majority. And many out of these questions were pretty easy to answer. They were one-liners. Geometry and mensuration, 2 questions were asked. One was based upon area of circle and the other was based upon triangles knowledge. That is, you should know the ratio of sides in a 30-60-90 triangle and a 45-45-90 triangle. There were 4 questions based on permutations and combinations. 2 out of those questions were fairly easy, based upon number of words that can be formed from a particular word that is given, number of arrangements that can be formed, but the other 2 were challenging. There were 4 questions based on data sufficiency. So 46 out of 50 questions were normal quant questions and the remaining 4 were data sufficiency questions. All the 4 data sufficiency questions were again based on time taken by train to cross various objects. So there were 4 direct time and distance questions and 4 data sufficiency questions based on time and distance. Out of those 4 DS questions, 2 questions were based on 2 statements given and 2 questions were based on 3 statements given. Now overall, the difficulty level of the section can be considered to be easy to moderate. There were some challenging questions present, but a student should be able to figure out which out of those questions are challenging and avoid solving them or avoid putting too much time in them. So the ideal number of attempts suggested in this section would be around 35 to 40 questions to be done in around 40 minutes with a good accuracy. Next, we'll discuss the abstract reasoning section. The abstract reasoning section, as expected, had 25 questions. Majority of the questions were based upon series. So let us discuss the breakup of the questions in abstract reasoning. So there were 5-figure series to find the next figure. 10 questions were based on that. Many out of these questions were fairly easy. There was one question where there was a 5-figure series and there was a missing figure. There was a question mark in between and you have to identify what will come in place of that question mark. There were 4-figure analogies. 2 questions were of that type. Fairly easy questions. Odd man out. There were 4 questions where there were 5 figures given and 1 out of them was the odd man out that was to be selected. And there was 1 question where 6 figures were given and 2 figures had to be selected which are different from the others. So odd man out with 2 figures to be selected as the odd man out. Okay, there was 1 such question. Then there were questions where 9 figures are given and you have to form 3 groups of 3 figures each. 3 such questions were present. Then there were questions where 5 figures were given and there were 5 shapes that were given. You have to identify which 3 out of those 5 when put together will form a complete square. These questions were challenging. A student would need very good imagination skills to be able to figure out which out of those figures when put together will generate a square. Then there was 1 question based upon counting number of triangles that are present in that figure and 1 question that is based upon dice. There were 4 views that were given of a dice and we had to find which number would be opposite to a particular number that was given. So that was the breakup of the 25 questions that were present on abstract reasoning. Many of the series based questions, analogies questions and that 3-figure grouping questions were easy. Those were the questions that students should have attempted first. Now counting of triangles would have been slightly lengthy. Similarly, the questions based upon finding which figures generate a square, those were difficult. The dice question again was easy. So ideally student should have attempted around 18 to 22 questions from this 25 in about 20 minutes.
So let's look at the analysis of the verbal ability reading comprehension section. So as we see here, it comprised 50 questions. The topic wise breakup, number of questions, and the total number of questions, the breakup of all of them is given here. So this particular section, VRC section, this time was predominantly reading comprehension and a vocabulary dominated section. As we see here, there were total number of 27 questions on vocabulary with synonym, antonyms, idioms, analogies, spelling errors, and odd man out type of questions. Out of which synonyms and antonyms had two of them which were moderately difficult, three of them which were slightly on the challenging side. Reason being, if a candidate or the test taker has kind of prepared these questions, practice them well through all the possible question types of reading comprehension and verbal ability, vocabulary at that, they must have found it slightly manageable. Talking about idioms, these were on the challenging side because there was one idiom that was directly asked. I mean, it was not put in the sentence, another was put in the sentence. So that must have been slightly easier, but thorough knowledge of idioms would be required to solve these questions. Analogy questions were a mix of moderate and challenging set, because some of them, if we knew the meaning of the words, however, the relationship was not easy to identify, these questions might have been a problem. Spelling errors largely doable with a few changes here and there with regards to the level of difficulty. So some were the words that we've always heard and we've also used. So I would say that those were moderately difficult because spellings were slightly longer with more number of letters. But the others, if someone has not practiced well, they must have found it slightly challenging. Odd man out, once again, was based on the general understanding of things and vocab, but it was not mostly vocab dominated, it was mostly based on the general understanding of it. Grammar, this time we did not see too many questions of them. There were a total of 5 questions only, out of which 2 were on phrase replacements. These were largely to do with prepositions and phrases kind of sentences where we had to identify which one would replace the underlined part. And there were correct incorrect sentences in which there were 4 types of 4 different options for sentences given, and we had to identify which part consisted of error, I mean which was the erroneous part. So it was more like identifying which part would be erroneous, so you could also put it as the error spotting part of it, as in which one was correct in terms of grammar and not. The level of difficulty of these were, if the test taker would have done the rules decently well, they must have found it relatively easy to do. Having said that, it was slightly on the moderately challenging side. Reading comprehension, as you can see, there were 15 questions of it. There was one passage that had a reasoning based question where the question asked which one of the following would the author agree with. So it was a reasoning based question where understanding of the premise of the argument and the conclusion of the argument would help us in identifying the answer. The level of difficulty for that, if the argument was understood well, would be moderately difficult because it was not a very challenging passage to essentially understand in terms of reading. Passage 2 comprised of 4 questions. These were slightly longish. I mean, in terms of the options given, the passage was slightly longish to read, but not a very difficult one to understand. Passage 3, same goes for passage 3, but highly dominated by vocab questions, largely direct in nature. Passage 4 was once again a mix of vocab and other questions. So it was a mix of largely vocab and other direct questions, or questions whose answers could be identified from the passage by slightly detailed kind of reading. But there was no reasoning based question apart from the first one that could be seen in passages 2, 3 or 4. So on the side of testing a critical reasoning of a candidate through these passages was not seen. In terms of verbal ability, parajumbles was asked through 3 questions. The paragraph was really easy to unjumble. And the other questions that followed from this particular set, which were 3 number, were essentially testing the candidates' understanding of the sequence of paragraph. So if you got the paragraph right, they were actually very easy to answer because they only asked the number of sentences after rearrangement of paragraphs. So overall, a section which would be largely a doable one if someone was well versed with the rules and the practice of the different sections that were discussed.
Let us do the analysis of logical reasoning section. In logical reasoning section, there were mainly 3 areas were tested: analytical puzzles, analytical reasoning, and verbal reasoning. Let us do first the analysis of analytical puzzles. So in analytical puzzles, there are questions from circular arrangement, distribution, quant-based reasoning, and games and tournaments. Out of the total 22 questions, the doable questions were circular arrangement and distribution questions were moderate levels. Quant-based reasoning and games and tournament were difficult questions, and also lengthy questions. So one can solve 14 to 15 questions from this analytical puzzle. In analytical reasoning, questions were from direction sense, blood relation, symbols and notations, coding decoding, analogies, series, odd man out, input output, Venn diagram, deductions, data sufficiency, and some were miscellaneous questions. So out of the total 46 questions, direction sense, blood relation, symbol notations, and coding, these questions were doable. Similarly, analogies and series questions also were doable. As such, this year, decision making questions were absent, and input output questions and Venn diagram, these 2 topics were newly added. In verbal reasoning section, there were total 7 questions, 4 questions from assertions and reasons, and 3 questions from course of action. So out of the total 7 questions, a person with good GK knowledge can solve 4 questions which were based on assertions and reasons, and course of action, these 3 questions were of moderate level. So in all, out of total 75 questions from this logical reasoning section, a good student with good preparation can solve 50 to 55 questions in a time slot of 60 minutes. So this was the analysis for the logical reasoning section.